They sold my beach house. Not listed it. Not foreclosed it. Sold it. I stood in the sand 20 yards away watching a real estate sign swing in the salt wind, while two contractors changed the locks on my own front door. The HOA president, Elaine Harper, was standing on the deck with a clipboard like she owned the Atlantic Ocean. She told the buyers the property had been abandoned for over a year. Then she pointed to my dock and said the boat tide there would be removed by the end of the day. What she didn't know was that the dock permit hanging inside that house wasn't just a permit. It was a federal shoreline easement deed tied to my family name since 1968. And that deed meant the house she sold didn't just sit on HOA property. It sat inside a protected coastal boundary the HOA had zero authority to touch. Elaine had just triggered a legal nightmare big enough to swallow her entire board. And she had done it in front of witnesses, contractors, and the people who thought they just bought my home. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it could bully the wrong person, stay with me, because what happened next cost them everything. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for 22 years my job was making sure people didn't build the wrong thing in the wrong place along America's coastlines. I spent most of that time working as a coastal infrastructure engineer for the Coast Guard before moving into private maritime surveying. My work revolved around one simple truth: shorelines are fragile, and the laws protecting them are complicated enough to ruin anyone who ignores them. I've seen developers lose millions because they misunderstood one line in a coastal easement. I've watched entire marina projects collapse because someone assumed a permit meant ownership. The ocean doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither do the regulations written to protect it. That's why the beach house meant something different to me than it would to most people. It wasn't some vacation trophy or rental property. My grandfather built it in the late 60s when this stretch of coastline was mostly fishermen, rusted trucks, and weathered docks. The place still smells like salt-soaked cedar whenever you open the front door. The siding is permanently bleached by sun and wind, and the dock out back creaks the same way it did when I was 10 years old, dropping crab traps with him at sunrise. At dusk, the tide bells down the shoreline start ringing when the water rises under the pilings. The sound carries across the marsh like slow wind chimes. That house is where my family learned how to listen to the ocean. I only make it down there a few weeks each year now. Work keeps me traveling between ports and survey contracts, so the place sits quiet most of the time behind its old hurricane shutters. The neighborhood eventually built an HOA, but I rarely dealt with them. Pay the dues, keep the grass trimmed, ignore the rest. That had always been the arrangement. Then a few months before all of this started, the letters began showing up. Warnings about property neglect. Notices about community compliance. The tone sharpened each time. At first, I barely paid attention. Looking back now, that first letter wasn't a warning. It was the beginning of a very expensive assumption. My grandfather built the house in 1968, back when this strip of coastline was little more than sand, marsh grass, and stubborn people who made their living from the water. Today the island looks polished. Vacation rentals line the shore. Boardwalk cafes sell lobster rolls for $20. Every third truck in the grocery store parking lot belongs to someone managing short-term properties. But when my grandfather first arrived here, none of that existed. The barrier island felt like the edge of the world. There were maybe 30 houses scattered along the dunes, most of them simple wood structures raised on pilings to survive the storms that rolled in every fall. The roads were narrow gravel tracks. At night, the only lights came from porch lamps and shrimp boats moving slowly across the horizon. Everyone knew everyone's. Most families either fished, trapped crabs in the marsh channels, or repaired boats that had survived too many hurricanes. My grandfather was one of the few outsiders. He had just finished a decade working shipyards along the Gulf Coast when he found the property listed in a county notice for land auctions. Back then, the county occasionally sold narrow coastal parcels to encourage development. Most people avoided them because barrier islands shift over time. One bad storm could erase years of work. But my grandfather understood water. He bought the land cheap and spent the next 2 years building the house himself. The foundation pilings were sunk deep into packed sand. The siding was thick cedar that resisted rot from salt air. The roof was pitched sharply so hurricane winds could slide over it instead of tearing it away. He didn't build it to impress anyone. He built it to last. The dock came later. At the time, shoreline access wasn't something you assumed. Coastal land sits in a complicated legal space between private property and public water. If you wanted to extend a dock or maintain access through the marsh, you had to negotiate directly with the county and coastal management office. My grandfather did exactly that. He met with the county surveyor, filed the proper paperwork, and secured something called a shoreline easement. In simple terms, it allowed him to maintain permanent access from his property to the water, including the right to keep a small dock structure inside the tidal boundary. Most people don't think twice about a dock. But legally, it matters a lot. Coastal easements are unique because they often attach to the original property deed itself. When that happens, the rights survive ownership changes and can't easily be overridden by later developments or community rules. Decades later, when the island started attracting investors and vacation property buyers, developers created neighborhood associations to manage the growing communities. The HOA that eventually formed around my grandfather's property arrived almost 30 years after the house was built. By that time, the easement had already been recorded with the county and attached to the deed. That meant the shoreline rights weren't just privileges granted by a neighborhood board. They were legally protected property rights tied to the land itself. Most modern HOAs understand this distinction. They know older coastal properties sometimes carry grandfathered access clauses that override newer community restrictions. But the people running my neighborhood association didn't seem to fully understand that. At the time, neither did I. To me, the dock was just where my grandfather taught me how to bait a crab trap and tie a proper marine knot before the tide turned. I didn't realize those old county documents would eventually become the single most important thing protecting that house. I hadn't been down to the island in almost 5 months. Work had kept me tied up along the Carolina coast, inspecting marina reinforcements after a late-season storm. By the time I finally turned onto the narrow bridge leading to the barrier island, the sky was heavy with late afternoon haze, the kind that makes the water look like brushed steel. The closer I got to my place, the more something felt off. At first, it was subtle. There was a fresh drift of sand piled unusually high against the side of my garage door, like it hadn't been cleared in a while. That wasn't strange by itself. Wind moves sand the way it wants. But the dune grass near the driveway had been trimmed sharply, almost aggressively, like someone had tried to correct the natural edges of the lot. Then I noticed new landscaping markers staked along the front walk, bright orange flags I didn't recognize. I slowed the truck. An unfamiliar SUV sat in my driveway. Not parked awkwardly, parked like it belonged there. My stomach tightened. I pulled in behind it and stepped out, boots crunching over loose shells embedded in the sand. The air smelled different, less like salt and cedar, more like fresh-cut lumber. That's when I saw it. A real estate sign planted squarely in my front yard. White post, blue panel, sold stamped across the bottom in bold red letters. For a second, I actually thought I was looking at the wrong house. I scanned the neighboring properties, checking rooflines and dune shapes, trying to convince myself I'd misjudged the lot. But there was my grandfather's weathered dock stretching into the marsh behind it. This was my house. 2 men stood at the front door. One held a cordless drill, the other was fitting a new deadbolt into place. I walked toward them slowly, heartbeat loud enough that I could feel it in my throat. "What's going on?" I asked. The man with the drill barely looked up. "You the inspector or something?" he said casually. "New owners moving in next week." The words didn't register at first. New owners. I felt the blood drain from my face. "This property isn't for sale," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The second contractor shrugged. "We just do the work, man. HOA handled the transaction." HOA. That word snapped everything into focus. I stepped back and looked up toward the deck. 3 figures stood there, leaning against the railing like spectators at a parade. Elaine Harper was in the center, sunglasses on despite the fading light, clipboard tucked against her hip. 2 other board members flanked her, arms folded. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked annoyed. And that's when I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Elaine Harper had been president of the HOA for 6 years, which in this neighborhood might as well have been a lifetime appointment. Before that, she'd worked as a real estate agent upstate, the kind who sold lifestyle transitions instead of houses. WH. And the island started shifting from fishing shacks to short-term rentals and polished vacation homes. She reinvented herself as the guardian of community standards. She liked that phrase. Community standards. It sounded noble, almost patriotic, the way she used it. In reality, it meant manicured dunes instead of wild grass, identical mailboxes, and strict fines for anyone whose property didn't look occupied year-round. Elaine had perfect white hair that never moved in the wind, not once. It sat in place like it had been engineered. She wore oversized sunglasses even on cloudy days, and she carried a clipboard the way a sheriff carries a badge. It wasn't just an accessory, it was authority. Part-time residents were her favorite targets. She believed absentee owners dragged down property values, said it openly at meetings, claimed empty houses invited decline. I'd heard about her through neighbors over the years but never had reason to deal with her directly. I paid my dues. I kept the yard trimmed when I was in town. I didn't cause trouble. From the deck, she looked down at me like I'd interrupted something important. "You should have responded to the notices," she called out calmly. There was no anger in her voice, no hesitation. Just certainty. I stared back at her, the real estate sign swaying between us in the salt wind. "What notices?" I asked. She adjusted the clipboard against her hip, unbothered. "The compliance violations, the delinquent assessments. We followed procedure." Procedure? The contractors kept working behind me, metal clicking against metal as they secured the new lock. Elaine didn't look like someone who had made a mistake. She looked like someone who believed she was absolutely right. And that was when I felt the first real flicker of something deeper than shock. Because if she truly believed the board had authority to sell my house, then either she was lying, or she didn't understand the law at all. Both possibilities were dangerous. Elaine came down from the deck slowly, like she was stepping into a routine conversation instead of standing in front of a house she had just sold. Up close, her expression didn't change, no embarrassment, no flicker of doubt. "We documented 6 months of abandonment," she said, flipping a page on her clipboard. "The property appeared vacant, landscaping violations, unpaid assessments, repeated failure to respond." "I pay my dues automatically," I said. She gave a small, dismissive smile. "Your account fell into delinquency once the fines were added. You ignored multiple compliance notices." My mind was moving faster now, trying to track what she was saying against what I knew to be legally possible. "And because of that," she continued, "the board voted to seize the property under our governing documents and auction it to recover losses." Auction it? Like it was a storage unit. I felt the wind push against my back, carrying the smell of low tide and something metallic from the drill behind me. "You can't seize a deeded property because of fines," I said carefully. "That requires foreclosure." Elaine didn't blink. "We followed the bylaws. They grant the association authority to enforce liens and remedy neglected parcels." Enforce liens. That was the word she was clinging to. Here's what most people don't realize. An HOA can place a lien on a property for unpaid dues or fines, but a lien isn't ownership. To legally sell a home, especially one with a recorded deed, the association has to go through judicial foreclosure. That means court filings, proper service of notice, and a judge signing off on the transfer. None of that had happened. No summons, no court order, no hearing. Just a real estate sign in my yard. I looked past her at the contractors finishing the lock installation. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that the board sold my house without a foreclosure judgment?" "We acted within our authority," she replied. Her voice stayed steady, practiced. Inside my head, the situation snapped into focus. Either they committed frauds, or they were dangerously ignorant of the law. Neither option ended well for them. I didn't argue with her on the driveway. Arguing would have given her something she understood: emotion, noise, escalation. Instead, I got back in my truck and drove straight to the small storage unit I rented 2 towns over. That's where I had my overflow mail forwarded whenever I was working extended contracts. If they claimed I'd been notified, I needed to see exactly what they sent. The unit smelled like cardboard and old rope. I cut open the plastic mail bin and dumped its contents onto a folding table. Envelopes spilled out in a thick stack. All from the HOA. Some were stamped "Final Notice" in red. Others had bold headers that read "Compliance Violation" or "Delinquent Account Status." The paper edges were curled from humidity, but they were unopened. Dozens of them. My name was correct. The mailing address was. They had sent everything to my previous apartment address in Wilmington, an address I had legally updated with the county tax office and the HOA itself 3 years earlier. I remembered submitting the form in person. I even had the confirmation email buried somewhere in my records. Yet every envelope in front of me bore that outdated address. I opened them one by one. The first letter cited overgrown dune grass and improper exterior maintenance, a $150 fine. The second added another $150 for continued noncompliance. By the fifth letter, the fines had doubled. By the 10th, they included administrative enforcement fees. Then came the escalation. A certified-looking notice, though it clearly hadn't been sent certified, stating the association would pursue legal remedies including lien enforcement and property seizure. Property seizure. The language grew more aggressive with each page, and none of it had reached me in real time. I leaned against the metal wall of the unit and let the weight of it settle. This wasn't random. In HOA enforcement, especially when it comes to fines and potential foreclosure, proper notice isn't optional. Associations are required to send critical notices, particularly lien filings and foreclosure warnings, via certified mail or another verifiable delivery method. They must be able to prove the homeowner received them or at least that delivery was attempted correctly. Without proof of delivery, enforcement collapses in court. That's not a loophole. It's due process. If they intentionally sent these to an outdated address despite having my updated information, that wasn't a clerical error. That was misdelivery. Possibly deliberate. I sorted the envelopes by date and lined them up across the table. The pattern was obvious. Each step in their process depended on me not responding, each fine stacked on top of silence they had engineered. By the final letter, the board claimed I had abandoned the property, and therefore forfeited my standing to contest enforcement. Abandoned. I looked at the stack again, the ink smudged slightly where humidity had seeped in. They didn't just assume I wouldn't respond. They made sure I couldn't. And that changed everything. The next morning I went back to the house before sunrise. I parked down the street this time and walked in along the shoreline, boots sinking slightly into damp sand. The tide was halfway out and the dock pilings cast long shadows across the marsh. For a moment, everything looked normal again, quiet, patient, untouched. Then I saw movement near the front steps. A couple stood in the driveway holding a folder between them. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, not investors, not aggressive, just uncertain. The man was studying the exterior like he was trying to memorize it. The woman kept glancing toward the road as if expecting someone to reassure her. I approached slowly. "Morning," I said. They turned, startled. "Hi," the woman replied, tightening her grip on the folder. "We're just looking at the place." I nodded toward the sold sign still planted in the yard. "Looking at the house you bought." The man hesitated. "Yes, we close officially next week. We were told we could come by and measure some rooms." I held his gaze for a second. "Who told you that?" "The HOA," he said. "Ms. Harper handled the transaction." There it was again. Elaine's. I let out a slow breath. This property isn't for sale, it never has been. They exchanged a quick glance, confusion spreading across their faces. "What do you mean?" the woman asked. "We were told the association had taken ownership due to abandonment." I felt a sharp twist of anger, but it wasn't directed at them. "We thought the HOA owned the property," the man added quietly. That sentence changed the temperature of the entire situation. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This wasn't an overzealous board misinterpreting bylaws. They had presented themselves as lawful owners to third-party buyers. "That's not how this works," I said carefully. "An HOA can't just take title and sell a deeded property without a court order." The woman's face went pale. "Are you saying this isn't legal?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the house, the weathered cedar siding, the dock behind it, the hurricane shutters my grandfather had bolted on by hand. Then I looked back at them. "I'm saying you were misled." And in that moment, this stopped being a neighborhood dispute. It became potential fraud. Elaine didn't wait long to respond. By mid-morning, she was back, striding up the driveway with the same deliberate pace, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon she knew how to use. Two board members trailed behind her, silent and stiff. The buyers were still standing near the porch when she arrived. Her smile appeared instantly, polished and rehearsed. "Good morning," she said brightly to them, then her eyes shifted to me, the warmth vanished. "Mr. Mercer, you are not authorized to be on this property." I almost T laughed at the phrasing. Not authorized, I repeated. This parcel was lawfully transferred by the association, she said. You were notified multiple times, you no longer have standing here. The buyers looked between us like spectators at a tennis match. I own this house, I said calmly. Elaine didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. If you refuse to leave, she replied, I'll have security escort you off the premises. She stepped aside and made a call. Within 15 minutes, a white SUV marked Coastal Community Patrol rolled up. Two uniformed private security officers stepped out, not deputies, not sheriff's department, HOA contracted security. Elaine pointed at me without hesitation. He's trespassing. The word hung in the air like a threat. One of the officers approached cautiously. Sir, do you live here? Yes, I said. Elaine cut in. He forfeited the property due to non-compliance and delinquent assessments. I reached into my back pocket slowly and pulled out my wallet. I handed the officer my driver's license, then walked to my truck and retrieved a folder I had brought intentionally. Inside were my latest property tax receipts, printed directly from the county database the night before. I handed those over as well. Taxes paid in full, I said. Deed recorded under my name, no foreclosure judgment, no transfer of title. The officer flipped through the papers, brow tightening slightly. He looked back at Elaine. Ma'am, do you have documentation of a court-ordered transfer? The association acted within its bylaws, she said sharply. That's not what I asked, he replied. The second officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. The buyer stood frozen near the porch. The first officer handed my documents back to me. Sir, he said carefully, until there's official documentation showing a change in ownership filed with the county, this remains a civil dispute. We can't remove you. Elaine's jaw tightened. He's interfering with a lawful sale, she insisted. The officer shook his head slightly. That's for a court to decide. For the first time since I arrived, I saw something flicker behind her sunglasses. Not doubt, but calculation. She had expected me to back down. Instead, the tension thickened, heavier than the humid coastal air. And I knew this wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of the tide moving under the dock usually settles me. It has a rhythm, water against wood, distant gulls, wind threading through dune grass. But this time, every creak felt like a countdown. At 7:03 the next morning, I called the one person who would understand the gravity of what was happening. Mark Ellison had been my attorney for over a decade. We met years ago during a permitting dispute involving a marina expansion. He specialized in property and coastal regulatory law, and more importantly, he didn't panic. When he answered, his voice was still thick with sleep. Daniel, everything okay? No, I said, they sold my house. There was a pause. What do you mean, sold it? The HOA, they claimed abandonment, placed fines, said they auctioned it to recover losses. There's a sign in my yard and buyers walking through. Silence. Not the confused kind. The calculating kind. They sold your house without foreclosure, he asked finally. Oh yes. Another pause, longer this time. That's not a mistake, that's liability. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the water beyond the window. They're saying they followed their bylaws. Bylaws don't override state foreclosure statutes, he said flatly. Did you receive a summons, court notice, anything filed through the county clerk? Nothing, they sent letters to an old address. Mark exhaled slowly. Okay, that's procedural failure on their part, possibly intentional. He was quiet for a moment, then his tone shifted. Let me ask you something important. Go ahead. Do you still have the shoreline easement deed? The question cut through everything. Yes, I said without hesitation. Original county recording from '68, attached to the property deed. Another pause, but this one felt different. Good, he said, because if they transferred title without recognizing that easement, they didn't just create civil exposure. They may have triggered regulatory violations tied to coastal management. I straightened slightly. You're saying... I'm saying, he interrupted, calm but firm, that deed changes the battlefield. The ocean outside rolled in steadily, indifferent to human arrogance. But for the first time since I saw that sign in my yard, I felt something shift. They hadn't just sold my house. They had stepped into a legal structure they clearly didn't understand. The truth didn't come from Elaine. It came from one of the quieter board members. 2 days after the security incident, I ran into Thomas Green at the marina. He'd served on the HOA for years but rarely spoke during meetings. Retired accountant, mild voice, the kind of man who preferred numbers to conflict. He looked uneasy when he saw me. "Daniel," he said, lowering his sunglasses, "you're still in town." "Seems I have a reason to be," I replied. He shifted his weight, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "Off the record," he said quietly, "this wasn't just about your fines." I didn't respond. I let him fill the silence. "The board's been discussing redevelopment for over a year," he continued. "Several properties flagged as seasonal or underused. The idea was to consolidate them, either through liens or distress acquisitions, and resell to investors. Luxury rentals. Short-term income properties designed to increase HOA revenue and raise surrounding values." "In mine?" I asked. Thomas hesitated. "Your lot sits on the cleanest stretch of beachfront in the community, direct marsh access, unobstructed view line. Developers have been asking about it." I felt the anger return, slower this time, colder. "They classified you as absentee," he said. "Low engagement, no response to violations. The board assumed you wouldn't contest enforcement." "Assumed?" "They thought once the sale closed, it would be too complicated for you to reverse," he added. "Most people don't have the resources to fight." The wind rattled a loose halyard against a sailboat mast nearby, sharp metallic taps breaking the quiet. "They counted on you staying silent," Thomas said softly. I stared out at the water, thinking about the stack of misaddressed letters, the rapid escalation of fines, the speed of the so-called auction. This hadn't been random enforcement. It had been positioning. My property wasn't just a target. It was prime inventory. And they believed I was too distant, too busy, too disengaged to defend it. That was their calculation. Their models. Their confidence. They had mistaken quiet for weakness. Major mistake. I drove back to my primary residence that afternoon, the long stretch of highway giving me too much time to think. Anger can cloud judgment. I've seen it happen in construction disputes, people reacting emotionally instead of strategically. What I needed wasn't outrage. I needed documentation. In the back of my office closet sat a fireproof metal box that hadn't been opened in years. It held the things my grandfather considered too important to leave in a bank vault. Original property deeds, shoreline surveys, handwritten notes about storm seasons, and a faded manila envelope sealed with brittle tape. I carried the box to my desk and unlocked it. The metal hinges creaked softly. Inside, beneath property tax receipts and old insurance policies, lay the envelope. The paper was thin and yellowed at the edges. My grandfather's handwriting stretched across the front in block letters. Shoreline easement, county recording 1968. I slid the documents out carefully. The first page bore the county seal, embossed faintly but still visible. It referenced the original parcel number, legal description of the land, and a recorded grant of permanent shoreline access. Permanent. That word mattered. The easement granted the property owner and successors the right to maintain unobstructed access to the tidal boundary, construct and repair a private dock within designated limits, and preserve a natural environmental buffer extending a fixed distance inland from the waterline. I read every line slowly. There it was, the clause most people overlook. The parcel was designated within a federally monitored coastal zone, subject to oversight under national shoreline protection statutes. Any alteration, interference, or unauthorized transfer affecting access rights within that boundary automatically triggered review by state coastal management authorities and, if applicable, federal regulators. In plain terms, no private entity, including an HOA, could interfere with that easement without stepping into regulatory jurisdiction far beyond neighborhood bylaws. My pulse slowed as the pieces aligned. Elaine and the board hadn't just placed a lien. They hadn't just misdirected mail or rushed an unlawful sale. By asserting control over the property and transferring it without recognizing the easement's federal designation, they had effectively interfered with a protected coastal right. That wasn't a clerical error. That was a regulatory violation. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the document. The HOA thought this was about landscaping fines and abandoned property narratives. They believed they had maneuvered around a quiet homeowner. What they didn't understand was that the land they tried to flip for profit sat inside a legal framework designed to protect shorelines from exactly this kind of interference. They hadn't just stolen my house. They had stepped into coastal protection law. And coastal protection law does not respond kindly to arrogance. The next morning, I began making calls. I started with the County Coastal Authority. After years in maritime work, I knew exactly which department handled shoreline. Compliance. I asked for the supervisor on duty and gave her the parcel number before she even finished introducing herself. I need confirmation on the easement attached to this property, I said, and I need to know whether any transfer request has been filed recognizing that designation. There was the sound of typing on the other end. A pause, then another. Sir, she said carefully, this parcel is flagged under monitored shoreline status. Any structural modification or ownership change affecting access rights should have triggered a review. It didn't, I replied. The HOA conducted a private sale. Silence again, longer this time. I'm escalating this to our compliance director, she said. Next, I called the state environmental office. I repeated the same information, referencing the 1968 easement and the federal shoreline clause. The tone shifted quickly from routine to alert. You're saying the association transferred control without notifying coastal management? The state coordinator asked. That's correct. She didn't hesitate. We'll need documentation immediately. Finally, I contacted the county property records office. I wanted confirmation of what I already suspected. No foreclosure judgment filed, the clerk said after reviewing the docket. No court-ordered transfer, title remains under your name. So no official change of ownership has been recorded. None. By mid-afternoon, my inbox began filling with confirmation emails, requests for scanned documents, notices of preliminary review. Then I received a direct call from a coastal compliance inspector. I just need to clarify something, he said. They sold land inside a protected shoreline boundary. Oh yes. And they did so without notifying state or federal oversight. Oh yes. The exhale on the other end wasn't subtle. That's a problem, he said. We're opening an investigation immediately. The word investigation carried weight. Within hours, the County Coastal Authority had flagged the property. The State Environmental Office initiated a regulatory inquiry. The Property Records Office annotated the parcel with a pending compliance review. This wasn't neighborhood politics anymore. It had moved into jurisdiction. And jurisdiction doesn't care about HOA bylaws. It cares about statutes, filings, and violations. For the first time since I saw that real estate sign in my yard, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Not hope. Leverage. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the clubhouse overlooking the dunes. Word had spread quickly. By the time I walked in, every folding chair was occupied. Homeowners lined the back wall, whispering in tight clusters. Elaine stood at the front beside a projection screen, posture rigid, clipboard in hand. The rest of the board sat behind a long table, expressions ranging from defensive to visibly nervous. Two additional guests sat off to the side. One wore a county identification badge clipped to his belt. The other had a state coastal management insignia embroidered on her jacket. Elaine began without looking at me. This special session addresses recent confusion regarding property enforcement actions, she said, voice steady. The board acted within community bylaws when responding to prolonged abandonment and delinquent assessments. Murmurs rippled through the room. I took a seat in the second row, hands folded, saying nothing. Elaine continued. The association has authority to place liens and pursue remedies to protect neighborhood standards. She emphasized the last phrase like it was sacred text. The county official stood slowly. With respect, he said evenly, this property is recorded within a federally monitored shoreline boundary. Elaine's jaw tightened. We are aware of its location. Then you're aware, he replied calmly, that your bylaws don't override federal shoreline protections. The words landed like a dropped anchor. The room went silent. One of the board members shifted in his seat. Another stared at the table. The state representative spoke next. Any transfer or interference involving that parcel required notification to coastal management authorities. That did not occur. Elaine straightened, trying to reclaim control. The board relied on internal governance documents, she said. We followed procedure. The county official met her gaze without raising his voice. Procedure that conflicts with statutory law exposes the association to liability. A low murmur moved through the homeowners. For the first time, Elaine's confidence faltered, not dramatically, not visibly to most. But I saw it. The realization that this was no longer about enforcement letters or landscaping violations. It was about jurisdiction. And jurisdiction outranked her clipboard. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. By Monday morning, county vehicles were parked along the street outside my house. Officials walked the perimeter with clipboards and measuring tools, documenting the dock alignment, the dune buffer, the recorded boundary lines tied to the easement. A state environmental officer photographed the shoreline markers while another reviewed satellite overlays on a tablet. Neighbors watched from porches. Whispers replaced the usual morning greetings. By midweek, the findings were no longer quiet. The county compliance report confirmed there had been no judicial foreclosure, no court-ordered transfer, and no legally recognized change of title. The so-called auction had no standing under state property law. That alone would have been enough. But the shoreline easement complicated it further. The report outlined that the HOA, by asserting ownership and facilitating a transfer within a federally monitored coastal zone, had interfered with protected access rights. The dock replacement permit application submitted by the buyers, at Elaine's direction, had listed the HOA as controlling authority. That single line triggered the state review. Under coastal protection statutes, any entity claiming control over property within designated shoreline buffers must demonstrate lawful authority and compliance with environmental oversight. The HOA had neither. What began as an internal enforcement action now read like a case study in overreach. Illegal property seizure. Fraudulent representation of ownership. Violation of recorded easement protections. Environmental interference within a monitored coastal boundary. Those weren't my words. They were written in the preliminary summary circulated to the board. The buyers withdrew first. I received a call from the couple's attorney requesting confirmation of my recorded title. Their financing institution had halted the transaction once the county flagged the parcel. Within 48 hours, the purchase agreement was formally terminated. The sold sign disappeared from my yard that same afternoon. But that was just the beginning. 2 homeowners filed civil complaints against the association for mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. Word spread that similar abandonment classifications had been applied to other part-time residents. Suddenly, neighbors were reviewing their own mail histories, checking lien filings, asking questions they had never asked before. The HOA's insurance carrier issued a notice of reservation of rights, legal language that meant coverage for the board's actions was not guaranteed. If the association had knowingly bypassed statutory foreclosure requirements, individual board members could face personal liability. Elaine stopped appearing outside. The clubhouse blinds remained closed during what were once open meetings. At a follow-up session attended by county officials, the compliance director stated plainly that the association's enforcement actions exceeded its legal authority. The sale was void. The lien filings were under review. Penalties for failure to notify state coastal management were pending assessment. The numbers being discussed were no longer minor fines. They were 5-figure administrative penalties, potential civil damages, and legal fees that could cripple the association's reserves. Neighbors who once nodded approvingly at Elaine's strict standards now avoided eye contact when I passed. Shock is a strange thing in a small community. It doesn't explode, it settles like fog. People had trusted the board to protect property values. Instead, the board had jeopardized them. The narrative collapsed quickly after that. What had been framed as decisive leadership against neglect now looked like calculated overreach. The same authority that once intimidated homeowners was now being questioned in front of regulators, attorneys, and insurers. And for the first time since this began, the balance of power shifted fully. Not because I shouted. Not because I threatened, but because documentation outran assumption. The HOA hadn't just made a mistake. They had exposed themselves. And the entire neighborhood was watching. The sheriff arrived on a gray morning, the kind where the ocean and sky blur into the same sheet of steel. I saw the cruiser pull onto the sand-packed shoulder outside my house just after 8. No lights, no siren, just quiet authority rolling to a stop in front of the cedar siding my grandfather had bolted together by hand. Elaine was already there. She stood near the porch steps with two board members, arms folded, posture stiff. The tension in the air felt heavier than the humidity. I stepped out of my truck and closed the door slowly. The sheriff climbed out of his vehicle and adjusted his hat, scanning the property before approaching us. "Morning," he said evenly. Elaine was the first to speak. "Deputy, thank you for coming. We need to resolve a trespassing situation." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to me. "You Daniel Mercer?" "Yes, sir." He pulled a folder from under his arm and opened it. Inside were copies of the county clerk's confirmation, the compliance no. Tice and the flagged parcel annotation. He read silently for a moment, then closed the folder. "Ma'am," he said to Elaine, "I've reviewed the county records." She straightened slightly. "As you know, the association executed a lawful transfer due to abandonment." The sheriff didn't raise his voice. "Sir," he said, looking directly at me then back at her, "this property has never legally changed hands." The words landed with a clarity that cut through everything. Elaine's jaw tightened. "Our bylaws don't supersede state law," he interrupted calmly. "There is no foreclosure judgment, no court-ordered deed transfer, and no recorded change in title." One of the board members shifted nervously. The sheriff continued, "Until a court determines otherwise, Mr. Mercer remains the lawful owner of record." Silence. The wind moved across the dunes, rattling the loose trim near the porch. Elaine tried once more. "We acted in good faith to protect the community." "That's not for me to decide," the sheriff replied, "but you cannot restrict lawful access to property he owns." He turned to the contractors who had been lingering near their truck. "Remove the replacement hardware," he instructed. The drill whirred again, this time in reverse. Metal screws backed out of the new deadbolt. The fresh lock assembly slid free from the door. One of the men handed me the original hardware, which had been tossed into a cardboard box days earlier. I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, the sound familiar and grounding. I fitted the original lock back into place, tightening it slowly, deliberately. No one spoke. When I turned the key, it moved smoothly. The door opened with a soft, resistant pull, the hinges protesting from disuse. The smell hit me first. Zold, old cedar. A faint trace of the engine oil my grandfather used to keep the hinges from rusting. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, catching dust particles suspended in the air. The living room looked untouched, frozen in the quiet way houses do when they've been waiting. I stepped inside. Behind me, I heard the sheriff speak again. "This is a civil matter moving forward. If there are further disputes, they'll be handled through the courts." The door closed gently behind me. For days, this house had felt like contested territory. Now it felt like mine again. Not because someone gave it back. Because the record had never surrendered it in the first place. And outside, the tide continued to rise, steady and indifferent, as if none of this drama had ever touched the shoreline at all. The sheriff restoring possession was the visible turning point. The real consequences came quietly through paperwork. Within a week, Mark filed a civil complaint in county court on my behalf. Fraudulent misrepresentation, slander of title, unlawful interference with property rights, intentional misdelivery of notice. The language was precise and unemotional, which made it far more devastating than anger ever could. The buyers filed their own claim 2 days later. They had paid deposits, inspection fees, and appraisal costs based on the HOA's assertion of lawful ownership. Their lender documented the disruption, and their attorney formally alleged misrepresentation and reliance damages. That's when the insurance carrier stepped in. Or rather, stepped back. The HOA's general liability insurer issued a denial of coverage letter citing intentional acts and actions outside the lawful scope of authority. In plain terms, if the board knowingly bypassed statutory foreclosure requirements and misrepresented ownership, the policy wouldn't shield them. No insurance buffer meant exposure. Direct exposure. The association's legal counsel resigned shortly after reviewing the case file. During a closed board session, details of which leaked within days, the attorney reportedly warned them that the absence of certified notice, lack of judicial foreclosure, and failure to disclose the shoreline easement created a multi-layered liability problem. Civil damages alone could exhaust reserve funds. But the environmental angle carried separate weight. The State Coastal Management Office issued a notice of violation for unauthorized interference within a monitored shoreline boundary. While the dock itself hadn't been altered, the assertion of control and initiation of structural planning without oversight triggered review under environmental compliance statutes. Administrative penalties were assessed against the association. The numbers were no longer abstract. 5 figures in regulatory fines. Legal defense costs rising by the hour. And because insurance refused coverage, those costs fell directly onto the HOA and potentially the board members who authorized the actions. Homeowners began attending meetings in record numbers. The tone shifted from polite inquiry to demand for accountability. How did this happen? Who approved the sale? Why weren't we informed? Financial statements were requested. Minutes were scrutinized. The vote authorizing the distress auction had passed by a narrow margin, but the documentation revealed something worse. The board had been advised by a junior management consultant, not a licensed attorney, that their bylaws allowed expedited transfer of neglected properties. They relied on internal interpretation instead of statutory compliance. That distinction mattered. Because when an HOA acts beyond its lawful authority, courts often pierce the corporate shield protecting individual board members. Meaning personal liability. Mark explained it plainly. If a court determines they knowingly exceeded their authority, Elaine and the voting members could be held individually responsible for damages. The gravity of that possibility changed the atmosphere entirely. Elaine's public appearances became rare. When she did attend a meeting, her confidence was thinner. The sunglasses remained, but the clipboard no longer felt like armor. 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, a special session was held to address leadership restructuring. Translation: resignation. Elaine stepped down from her position as president, citing health concerns and undue stress. The statement was brief, rehearsed, and devoid of acknowledgement. No apologies, no admissions, but resignation nonetheless. The board voted to appoint an interim president pending a full membership election. Meanwhile, the county prosecutor's office confirmed they were reviewing the file for potential criminal elements related to fraudulent representation in the attempted sale. No charges were filed immediately, but the phrase ongoing review carried its own pressure. The civil suit progressed. Mediation was scheduled. Within weeks, settlement discussions began. The HOA's attorney, newly retained, reached out with a proposal: reimbursement of legal fees, compensation for reputational damage, formal rescission of all fines, and a written acknowledgement of my lawful ownership and easement rights. It wasn't generous, but it was strategic. They wanted containment. What they didn't anticipate was that this case had already expanded beyond private resolution. Multiple homeowners retained independent counsel to review past enforcement actions. 2 additional properties previously labeled abandoned were found to have similar notice irregularities. The narrative of firm leadership protecting community standards had unraveled into a pattern of overreach. For me, the settlement discussions were less about money and more about precedent. I insisted on one clause above all others: formal recognition of the shoreline easement and written confirmation that no future enforcement action could interfere with those rights without documented statutory compliance. They agreed. Reluctantly. By the time mediation concluded, the HOA had committed to financial compensation, internal governance reform, and mandatory legal oversight for any lien or foreclosure action moving forward. Elaine no longer held a title. The board members who voted for the sale faced the real possibility of contributing personally to settlement payments if insurance coverage remained denied. What began as a real estate sign in my yard had turned into lawsuits, regulatory penalties, leadership collapse, and potential criminal review. All because they assumed silence meant surrender. They were wronged, and now they were paying for it. The legal fallout was loud. The community fallout was quieter. It started with small things. A knock on my door one evening just before sunset. I opened it to find Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down, hands folded tightly in front of her. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. The tide bells were ringing faintly behind her, the marsh breathing in with the rising water. I voted with Elaine, she continued. I believed what we were told, that you abandoned the place, that fines went unanswered, that the association had no other option. Her voice wavered slightly. I didn't know the notices were sent to the wrong address. I nodded. Most people didn't. That became the patterns. One by one, neighbors approached me on the boardwalk at the marina outside the mailbox cluster. Some were direct. Others circled around the subject before finally admitting they had trusted the board's version of events. We thought it was procedural. We assumed there had been a court. She made it sound like you'd just disappeared. Truth spreads differently in a small coastal community. It doesn't explode across headlines. It travels through porch conversations, grocery lines, and dock repairs. It carries weight because it's personal. Once the compliance reports and court filings became accessible to homeowners, the narrative shifted completely. Copies of the county findings circulated through email threads. Screenshots of the recorded deed and easement clause were shared in neighborhood group chats. The words fraud, liability, and regulatory violation replaced community standards and enforcement. Anger turned inward. At a packed membership meeting held 3 weeks after Elaine's resignation, homeowners demanded a full audit of board decisions from the previous 2 years. The treasurer struggled to answer questions about reserve fund exposure and mounting legal costs. Why were we never told about the shoreline designation? Someone asked from the back row. No one had an answer. A motion was introduced to dissolve the current leadership structure entirely and call for emergency elections under revised governance procedures. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Within a month, the remaining board members stepped down. An interim committee formed, comprised mostly of long-term residents who had lived on the island before vacation rentals dominated the market. People who understood storms, erosion, and the delicate balance between property value and coastal reality. When the new board was elected, their first official act was to commission independent legal counsel to review all enforcement policies. Their second was to send a written apology to every homeowner who had been flagged for abandonment in the previous 3 years. I received a copy of that letter. It acknowledged procedural failures. It committed to transparent notice requirements. It affirmed recognition of all recorded easements and statutory protections. The tone was different. Less authoritarian. More cautious. The real reckoning wasn't just about me. It was about a community realizing how easily power can drift when no one checks it. For years, neighbors had equated strict enforcement with stability. Now they understood the difference between order and overreach. The island felt quieter after that. Not empty, just aware. And awareness changes everything. A week after the final mediation papers were signed, I drove back down to the island with my nephew Caleb. He's 16, all elbows and restless energy, more comfortable with a fishing rod than a phone. He'd been following the situation quietly, asking careful questions without pushing. The dock had taken a beating over the winter. Nothing dramatic, just loose boards and a railing that leaned slightly toward the marsh. Storm tides have a way of testing anything that claims permanence. We carried fresh planks down from the truck as the morning sun burned off the fog. The air smelled like salt and wet grass. Pelicans skimmed low over the water, wings nearly touching the surface. Caleb knelt beside me as I pried up one of the older boards. "You think it'll hold another 20 years?" he asked. "It's already held more than 50, I said. We worked in steady silence for a while, replacing rusted screws, reinforcing the support braces underneath. When I shifted one of the beams near the base, something caught my eye. There, carved into the wood, weathered but still visible, were faint block letters. I brushed away sand and salt residue with my thumb. "This water will outlast all of us." My grandfather's handwriting. I hadn't noticed it before, or maybe I had years ago and forgotten. Time does that, erases details until something forces you to see them again. Caleb leaned closer. He wrote that. "Yeah," I said quietly. The tide was moving in, slow and steady beneath us, just like it had the day my grandfather first tied a rope to these pilings. For months, this house had felt like contested ground, legal documents, court filings, arguments about authority. But standing there looking at those carved words, the fight felt smaller. Temporary. The water didn't care about bylaws or board votes. It moved according to forces older than any of us. My grandfather understood that. He built this place knowing storms would come, knowing ownership isn't just paperwork, it's stewardship. I tightened the last bolt into place and stood, the dock firm beneath my boots. The house wasn't just reclaimed. It was anchored. And as the tide lifted against the pilings, I realized something simple and steady. Legacy isn't defended with anger. It's protected with patience. And sometimes with proof. That evening I stood on the deck as the sun slid toward the horizon, turning the marsh gold and the ocean beyond it copper. The wind was softer now. The real estate sign was gone. The driveway was empty. The house felt settled again, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for months. The tide bells down the shoreline began their slow, familiar ringing. I rested my hands on the railing my grandfather installed decades ago and watched the light fade across the water. So much noise had passed through this place, letters, accusations, meetings, legal filings. And yet the ocean remained steady, indifferent to human arrogance. Here's what I've learned through all of this. HOAs can protect neighborhoods. They can preserve shared spaces, maintain order, and prevent neglect. But unchecked power, especially when wrapped in the language of standards, becomes something else. It becomes a sue, empty on, and assumption when backed by authority without accountability becomes abuse. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it could rewrite the law, share your story below. And if you want more real property battles and quiet justice stories like this one, hit subscribe.